we have the makings of what could be a hard winter. Hard winter meaning colder than normal and snowier than normal.
Meteorologist Don Day joins us for the full program as we look at our extended weather forecast for the summer and fall across North America. He'll discuss what lies ahead as a La Nina weather pattern now begins to take shape. But first, we'll discuss modern weather forecasting and what it's going to take in order to have even more accurate forecasts.
Real measured atmospheric oceanic information. We need more of that to get better weather forecasts.
And finally, are you an anecdotal climatologist?
This isn't the way the weather was when my grandpa was around. All those comments that just fit under what I call the umbrella of anecdotal climatology, where it's anecdotes, but it's not based on what I call observation science.
All of us are affected by weather, and today's show is going to provide you some insight that I hope will help you in assisting your management decisions for the next 6 months on this episode of the Working Ranch Radio Show. And we welcome you back here to the Working Ranch Radio Show. I'm Justin Mills, your host. Glad to have you joined in on our program here today. Yeah, as you heard there in the opening, meteorologist Don Day is in as we're going to be talking about the extended look at our weather forecast. And let me just tell you this. You can thank us later because more than likely at some point here today, after you listen to this show, you're going to be in a conversation where weather is going to come up. Probably more times than not. And you're going to be the one armed with the most information because you just listened to our show here today. So you can thank us for that. And if you enjoy the program and you miss something, maybe you're listening on the radio and you miss something, you want to go back and listen to it, you can go to the podcast site at workingranchradio.com or any podcast provider out there as well and listen to it from that point there. Now, also on today's program, the Captain Tim O'Byrne will be in for this week's edition of Tim's 2 Cents. And we'll have a conversation with Ted Perry of Purina about how we can leverage our nutritional management practices on our ranches in order to create more value in those market animals or even those replacement animals for our herd as well. So a good discussion there. Be sure to stick around for that. Now, just a reminder here. In fact, I got reminded of this as I was flipping through Facebook the other day, and I came across Working Ranch Magazine's Facebook post reminding me, and I knew this, but I'd forgot that May is beef month. So on your social media, how about you pass along the good news, the good things that we're doing here in agriculture and our beef industry to your friends and the folks that follow you, and spread the facts about the beef industry and what we do here in the ranching industry as well. So just remember, this month, May, is beef month. Well, let's turn now towards our topic of the day, and joining us is meteorologist Don Day. And Don, thanks for joining us with this more of an extended outlook as we take a look at our 6-month outlook on weather. Appreciate you taking the time to do that today.
Looking forward to it.
All right. Well, let's jump right into this because as I have said before, a lot of times one of the things I really enjoy about the weather that you provide is a lot of times you pad that weather, the current weather we're having, with a look back and some trends. And really, that's pretty important to understand what the history has been before we just start jumping out into, well, here's where we think it's going to go. And I phrase think on that part, because sometimes if people don't really look in the past, there's more of a guesstimation of what the future is going to be. So let's kind of look back over where we've come out of, because it has been some pretty significant weather the last 2 or 3 years when we look at drought situations across different parts of the country, where parts of the country have seen moisture, where it's been dry, and those kinds of things. So let's look at where we've been at here for the last couple, 3 years with our weather.
Yeah, that's a good point, because really, especially in the last 24 months, a lot has happened with the weather patterns that really affect how things go in North America and a lot of the Western Hemisphere. And as you and I talk about all the time, you and I talk a lot about what's going on out in the Pacific. And from early 2020 through 2022, we were in a very robust, long-lasting La Nina, where that tropical Pacific is cold. And there's very good reason why a lot of the central and western areas of the United States were in many, during that 3-year period, there were a lot of that time was drought or near drought conditions, and in some areas severe drought. And then in 2023, we finally saw that pattern go away. And in the spring of 2023, we saw a rapidly developing El Nino. And if we rewind a little bit, go back to the winter of 2023, that was the winter of giant snows in the Sierra Nevada. We saw significant snowpack in the west. All the talk about Lake Mead and Lake Powell drying up went away as tons of water went into those areas, as that Pacific changed from La Nina, a 3-year La Nina, to an El Nino. That transition phase really changed the dynamic. And if we look at a drought monitor map at the time that we made this recording to 2 or 3 years ago, it looks completely different. And since that El Nino came in, precipitation patterns in many areas have changed a little bit. The dynamics have changed a bit. It ended up giving us the El Nino, a bit of a milder winter than compared to the last 2 or 3. And now we're sitting here going, well, all right, we're in El Nino, right? Mm-hmm. Well, it was a one-hit wonder. It lasted only about 11 months, and it's going away. And so we're seeing the Pacific going through another change. So after about 3 years of very little change in the Pacific, we had a 1-year change, and now it's reverting back to a colder phase again.
Mm-hmm. As we had talked about, looking back historically on this, and I know we have referenced previous year, 10, 11 year models in what we're experiencing now, what we have come out of. Are we correlating with what we have seen in those patterns? And when I'm saying weather patterns or cycles, we're talking, more than just a 3 or 5 or 10 year, but even further out than that. How is that correlating and matching up to what we've been through?
Well, if you just take this past year, when we went from La Nina to El Nino, when you're in an El Nino situation where those subtropical waters near the equator in the Pacific warm up, you do tend to see the weather in the far west and southwest United States and parts of the southeast get wet. That's exactly what's happened. If you look at where it's been very wet, been across the south central and the southeast United States, and we had another very good snowpack year in many areas of not all of the Rockies, but the central and southern Rockies, Sierra Nevada, again, doing well. You also tend to have a milder than normal winter. We saw that. We also have less precipitation across some parts of the North United States, and we saw that, especially across the northern Rockies and the northern plains for most of winter. So things have gone about expected. Mm-hmm. When you look at the big picture, when you look at these cycles, especially out in the Pacific, there's no standard length of time they tend to go. They'll tend to go into periods between 1 to 3 years, sometimes 3 to 5. And we also pay very close attention to the lengths of those cycles. So what we have experienced over the last 4 or 5 years does match up with historical trends. That's why we're always trying to second guess what's going to be happening in our ocean basins in the Northern Hemisphere, especially the Pacific. The Atlantic's important too. That's going to play a role in the hurricane season this year and how those cycles interact and work together.
Mm-hmm. As time continues on, we continue to get more and more data that allows us to give us a little bit more accuracy in what we're doing as we move forward in this. How far back do we have what you feel is good, accurate data that helps you in what you're doing every day in meteorology?
Well, that's a good question, and something that people don't realize. I think we take for granted that especially for North America, is that we really only have really good recorded weather information whether it was temperature or pressure or wind speed, going back to right around the turn of the century. And even then, not until the interstates were built and railroads were built and telegraph systems were built before we started to really pay attention and write down weather conditions. In fact, really, if you look at the history of recorded weather observations, not only here, but across the globe, it really wasn't until the airplane was invented that a lot more attention was paid to the weather. It makes good sense, right? Why am I going to get in an airplane and fly into bad weather? So we have a little bit more than 100 years of good weather. And then we have what we call the satellite record, to where the satellites were in place and really gathering and recording and archiving data. And that really only goes back to the late 1970s. Now, for people like you and me, going back to the late 70s doesn't seem too long ago. For some people, that may be, well, that was a long time ago. But we really don't have good stuff. So when we look at recorded weather observations and data to where we can really feel confident. It really is, honestly, in my opinion, doesn't really start till just after World War II. And then when we start to overlay the satellite record, that didn't happen until 30 some years later. So we're looking at it in terms of a robust database of weather data. Robust meaning we're really confident that it was measured correctly, and it's going to be the most useful. It really goes back to the late 1940s.
Mm-hmm. When you talk about that, I asked that question for two reasons. One, so we're understanding where some of this information is coming from, but also the second side of that question was, in our society now, we're constantly being bombarded with anytime there's major issues with our weather, the conversation turning to climate change. And the reality of some of that is they're also on about as little of data as we are when it comes to weather forecasting in some ways as well. Am I assuming that right?
No, you are. And it's very easy to get trapped into this. Let's just take an example. We've had a lot of severe weather this spring with a lot of tornadoes, very severe tornadoes in the nation's midsection. And I heard from people, I saw lots of comments online that says, well, yeah, this tornado was bad, but this is just not a normal tornado. This is not a normal situation. And for somebody like me who does this every day, and it's just like, well, would you explain to me what is a normal tornado? And how do you measure that against the historical record? So comments like that really have no basis in having any historical perspective or really having any knowledge of how our weather and climate systems work. And so the attachment of the word normal to any weather or climate system, boy, you really got to be careful, because when we try to normalize things or try to come up with averages or come up with, I hear this all the time, well, it shouldn't be that way, or this isn't the way the weather was when my grandpa was around. All those comments that just fit under what I call the umbrella of anecdotal climatology, where it's anecdotes, but it's not based on what I call observation science. If you go into observed weather, and we talked about going back to the late 1940s, so when you have good recorded observational data, observations of what the weather was really like measured, what the temperature was, what the humidity was, what the pressure was, what you find out is that we've seen all these things before. Maybe some location hadn't seen something like this in 30 years, but it doesn't mean it's never happened before. And so you got to be really, really careful with that. And I think it leads people down the wrong path of really trying to understand how the weather and climate systems work. As we talk about all the time, the weather is not linear. It never travels on one path and goes the same direction. If anything you graph in the weather, whether it's temperature, pressure, or wind, it's always going to be a sine wave. There's going to be peaks and there's going to be valleys. There's going to be ups and there's going to be downs. Trying to put a human perception on what the weather should be or how it should be is just futile. It's never going to get you anywhere to help you better understand how things work.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good point. I think, as you said that, I thought our society, our human nature is that we want to put a humanistic approach to something that's very, in a way, very scientific, and massage that in there to the point that we think that it helps us understand. In fact, if we could name the weather with a human name.
Well, and they do that. I mean, now we're naming, we name hurricanes, right? Yeah. And now they're naming winter storms.
Yeah.
And that's a good point. And I think there's a little bit of danger in doing that, because you're applying what you think should be a human emotion or a human action on what is going on in nature. And that's not, it's a good way to remember a storm by giving it a name, but it does overlay it some human aspect to it when that is farthest from the truth.
Yeah. Well, let's take a break here. My guest today is meteorologist Don Day joining us. We're eventually going to get into more looking at our long-term weather 6 to 7 months out as we look at the rest of the spring, summer, and fall. But I also just wanted to pick his brain a bit just on weather forecasting. When we come back, I want to go a little bit further, Don, in our conversation of where do you see us going in the future of weather forecasting, and then we'll continue to get into our long-term weather outlook as well. This is the Working Ranch Radio Show. We'll be back right after this.
This year, choose to unlock the full potential of your cattle operation with K-Line Irrigation, the affordable and dynamic solution for grass-based livestock operations. Beat drought by planning ahead with the most user-friendly irrigation system. K-line systems ensure optimal water distribution across all acres and are unencumbered by obstacles such as fence lines or steep terrain. Don't miss out on untapped pasture potential. Choose K-line to secure the future of your grazing operation. For more information, visit our website at www.k-linena.com. Be sure to fill out a consultation form so our designers can create an estimate for your project. K-line irrigation. For greener, more productive pastures anywhere.
Welcome back to the Working Ranch Radio Show. As we continue on now, we're eventually going to be getting into looking at our long-term weather outlook. And when I say long-term, I'm meaning the rest of the spring into summer and early parts of fall, as our guest Don Day joining us as he does each and every week with the kind of the 7 to 10 outlook. We're going to look a little bit further out here today. Don, as we talked a little bit in the last segment, we were first recapping kind of where we have come in the last couple, 3 years with the weather, but then we also kind of moved into a little bit of weather forecasting just in general. And I wrote down a question here that I wanted to ask you, and that was, where do you see, as we move forward in the future and we continue to gather more and more data, where do you see the future of weather forecasting moving towards that is going to continue? Because I think the goal really is to continue to be more and more accurate. How accurate is that? Are we able to, going in your mind, do you think we're going to get?
Okay, well, good question. There's two really important things to remember about weather forecasting. One is that the ability to forecast quickly and as accurately as possible, and maybe as far into the future as we possibly can. A lot of that depends on computing power. And with the technology that we have now with our high-speed computers and the emerging technology of artificial intelligence, AI, all of those things are really, really important. You could have the fastest computer in the world, in the universe, okay? But for a weather forecast to be as good as possible, we have to remember there's more than just computing power. First of all, you need good observations. We had talked about this in the beginning segment about how critical it is to have the atmosphere accurately measured as possible in as many locations as possible and in as many different layers of the atmosphere as possible. But we also have to have very accurate information over the world's oceans. We have to have accurate information in the oceans. We have to have very accurate information on what I call outside Earth influences, solar radiation, solar flux, cosmic rays. It makes your head spin when you put together all those things. So here we are, and if you look at our technology, look at where we are with computing power and AI, I don't think we realize how much of the world is still very far behind where we are in terms of putting in weather stations and putting in the technology to measure the weather. If you were to look at the continent of Africa, and if you were to look at how many locations have been accurately recording weather observations for long periods of time, first thing you'll realize there's very few, and they haven't been doing it for very long. And I could show you other parts of the Southern Hemisphere in particular. The Southern Hemisphere is mostly ocean. Mm-hmm. So there are parts of the world where we have very little weather data coming in. And so you might say, well, Don, we've got all these great satellites. We've got all this, technology floating around up there. It's like, yeah, we do. But one reason we can live on this planet is that we have a very dense atmosphere. And even the technology of satellites still can't penetrate and measure accurately from space to the ground to the bottom of the oceans. They don't have the power, the technology to do it. That's why people say, why do we still put up weather balloons twice a day across the world? Mm-hmm. Well, that's why. Satellites still can't do it yet. So we have a problem. Our computing power gets better and better and better. But our observation database, while it's improving and getting better, here's one thing that's really helped weather forecasting. You may not realize it. Next time you get on an aircraft, a newer aircraft, passenger aircraft, let's say you're flying from San Francisco to Tokyo. Well, there's sensors now on a lot of the new aircraft that's measuring meteorological data and sending that back. Okay, so that's one example of how we're getting better data. But we have a tremendous way to go to measure the Earth at any moment in time and what the atmosphere and the oceans are doing and be able to take that data, put it into our high-speed computers so we can come up with a more accurate forecast. Because when you have 2 or 3 data points over 500 miles in Africa, that's not good. Okay.
Yeah.
I like to use the analogy of a fishnet. So if you were to have all these different points across the globe where you're measuring the weather, the atmosphere, the oceans, and your net is 5 miles apart on where the square is for that net. Okay. Big fish can get through that net. Okay. So you want a smaller, you want higher resolution, you want more netting in your net because those weather fish can get through. And so that's part of our problem is there's things that impact our weather, especially over time, that we're not measuring. So our computers can get super fast. We can have super great technology, but the inputs, that observation, real measured atmospheric oceanic information, we need more of that to get better weather forecasts, especially getting past 5 days. Getting past 5 days is still a hard thing.
Yeah. Okay, let's get into the main subject here and start working through this. Let's get into where generally what you see taking shape across the North American continent that's going to shape our weather in the next few weeks all the way out into the early parts of fall.
So since we are going out of an El Nino into a La Nina phase, I do think La Nina is going to have some impact on the weather this summer for parts of the United States. I don't think the impacts are going to be severe, but there's a couple of things about La Nina that we do need to talk about. And so when we take a look at this summer, let's go June to August.
Okay.
We'll call it June through August. If we were to start, first of all, with the large scale impacts, I want to talk a little bit about the hurricane season. Mm-hmm. One thing that we have found historically is that when the Pacific gets a little bit colder in the summer, La Nina, and the Atlantic along the equator to where the Atlantic and the equator meet Africa, when that area tends to be warmer, and we'll throw in the Gulf of Mexico and the Caribbean as well, when it's colder in the Pacific and warmer in the Atlantic, that is a recipe for a very active hurricane season. So for the southeastern United States, the Gulf Coast states, the mid-Atlantic, Florida, up along the East Coast, there's a pretty strong likelihood of a bigger hurricane and tropical storm season this year. And it could start as early as June and go all the way up through October. So that's one impact that we're going to see from the ocean conditions. The other impact is likely going to be there's some parts to the western United States that are going to have a warmer, drier summer. And I think this is really going to be the case in the desert Southwest. It does look like a drier than average summer is going to be found across Arizona, New Mexico, the Four Corners region. And one reason for that is when the Pacific is cold there off the coast of Mexico, which it is, that leads to less thunderstorm activity. So it does look warmer and drier for the desert Southwest and the Southern Rockies during that June to August timeframe. One area of the country that I think is going to continue to be wet, that has gotten wet here recently, is from the Southern Plains, from Central and East Texas, up through the Central and Western Corn Belt, and then that's going to go all the way up into the Dakotas, and probably for the Eastern Corn Belt is an area that may be a little bit drier, but I see it being pretty wet this summer across those areas. So you could just basically go right down the middle of the country from east of the Rockies through the Northern Plains, Southern Plains, and then into the Great Lakes. That's where I think it's going to be the most wet. As we get into the southeastern United States, I think they may start off the summer season, a little bit drier before the hurricane season starts. And that's where I think that they're going to likely see their heavier precipitation. Is there any part of the U.S. that I'm worried about going into a drought this summer? I would say that Southwest United States and maybe parts of the Central Rockies and the Central High Plains, since we may not have that active thunderstorm pattern coming up out of the Pacific, coming up out of Mexico, or what we call the North American monsoon, that's an area of dryness and warmer than normal temperatures that I foresee.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, and even right now, when we look at the latest drought monitor, that is an area that is showing dryness, as well as even up into parts of Kansas. Let's take a break here. When we come back, let's slip into then the fall time of the year if we can with some of that as we continue on now. My guest today is meteorologist Don Day. We'll be back on the Working Ranch Radio Show right after this.
What if your commercial beef herd could be better than you thought possible? Genetic testing can help give you more confidence about what your herd is made of, and more importantly, what it can be. Inherit Select from Zoetis provides data-driven genetic insights to help you make more informed selection, breeding, and culling decisions about your cows and heifers. The journey from genetic potential to reality begins with Inherit Select. Ask a genetics rep how to save on testing with our whole herd promotion. Go to beefgenetics.com/radio.
Welcome back to the Working Ranch Radio Show. As we continue on now, our guest today is meteorologist Don Day, on for a little bit longer than the 3 to 4 or 5 minutes that you typically are on every week, and we'll be doing that here later on in the show, so be sure to stick around for that. Don, as you were talking, we got through the summer months, June, July, August. As we look into fall, what's going to start to transition, or will there be any transitions that's going to make any changes weather-wise for parts of the country?
Well, I think the fall and early winter season has the potential to be what I like to say, the word interesting. Okay. When you hear meteorologists say interesting, I guess you should be nervous. And the reason I say that is that we're going to be fully developed into probably a moderately sized strength La Nina will be formed by then. And we're also seeing an overall decrease, at least in the predictions, of sea surface temperatures across a good part of the tropical Pacific where that La Nina is, but also all the way west into the Indian Ocean and even many parts of the Atlantic Basin. There's just the models are predicting an overall decrease. And so when we find where we're going to be this fall and early winter compared to this past one, it's a different setup. Mm-hmm. And we talked about how we had a pretty mild winter. We had a couple of Arctic outbreaks, but we didn't have that many and they didn't last very long. I think this fall and winter has the potential to be colder and get off to a colder start. So as we get into September is that transition month for a lot of the United States. September is still summer, but you start to see those northern areas get into a little bit of fall. Mm-hmm. So from what I'm seeing, I think the potential for early season cold starting in September and early October in the northern and northwest parts of the United States is on the table. And I'm basing that on the ocean basins getting colder, especially along the equator areas. And also from what we're seeing out in the North Pacific, this sounds counterintuitive, but a lot of times when we see the equator areas get colder, sometimes it gets a little bit warmer in the higher northern latitudes, which is actually a cold signal. Mm-hmm. So if I were to describe what I think is going to happen between September to, let's say, December, is it's going to be colder than last year. The potential for early cold, meaning possible early freezes, is on the table. And I think it could set the stage for a much rougher winter for a lot of the U.S., Canada as well. A lot more winter than last winter. And last winter was really El Nino dominated. This one will be La Nina dominated, but we may also see the La Nina weaken. We're seeing that potential as we get into the first of the year. Mm-hmm. So we have the makings of what could be a hard winter. Hard winter meaning colder than normal and snowier than normal. And certainly if we were to contrast what we expect this upcoming winter to this last winter, it'll be different. Okay.
So you talked about that generally over the United States. Let's maybe separate this up a little bit and go through generally northwest, south, and middle, and then the East Coast a little bit. I hate to be so general in that, but that will give us some idea of where different folks are listening in might find some value in what we're trying to talk about here today.
Okay, so where do you want to start first?
Well, let's just start from where the weather comes from. Let's start in the Northwest or the West.
Yeah, so the Pacific Northwest and Northern California and the Northern Rockies, and I'll throw in British Columbia and Alberta there. I think they're definitely going to see the beginnings of a colder, wet pattern, and I think that's really going to start in earnest in December. There's some real indication that historically a La Nina start to the winter is cold and wet in the Pacific Northwest, and that would extend across all of South Central and Southwest Canada. That would get into the Northern Rockies and the western areas of the Northern Plains, while, maybe December across the central and the southeastern United States has a fairly warm start to it. Mm-hmm. But what tends to happen in historical terms from what we've seen before is as we get into January and February, that cold then spreads across the rest of the central and eastern United States.
Okay.
It is extremely rare to have all of the lower 48 have the same weather anomaly, so to speak.
Yeah.
So when it tends to be cold in the Pacific Northwest and the far west, it tends to be warmer in the central and the east.
Okay.
So winter is going to start off in earnest in the far west and northwest first. Then January and into February is where we see the cold spreading across the nation's interior, the northern plains, and the Great Lakes. The big question is always, where is the center of the cold going to be if it's going to be a cold winter? No, I would say it's going to favor those northern plains, upper Midwest the most.
Okay. So you talked a little bit about the East Coast real quick. What do you anticipate there for winter?
Well, I think they'll start off mild. I do think November and December for them has got the potential to be a little bit warmer than normal. Where I do see them getting colder is going to be that let's say after Christmas time into the first of the year into January and February. And they had a very mild winter last year. The East Coast did very mild. They really did not even, some of the bigger snows didn't happen until spring in some of the east and northeastern areas of the United States. Well, it's going to be different this year. Will the severity of the winter be as bad as I think the nation's midsection? No, but the East, folks in the East should expect a lot more winter in the winter of 24-25 than they did in 23-24.
Okay. Let's swing back around to South Central, because you had also mentioned earlier that an area that's starting to show some dryness, and we, as I had alluded to before, you even see it on the latest drought monitor map as well. And let's talk about those four corners: Arizona, New Mexico, into southwestern Texas. And Kansas. I'm throwing Kansas in there because they just have been dry, and they've been dry for several years, and the panhandle of Oklahoma. What's it look like for them?
Well, certainly the what should strike the fear in anybody in central and western Kansas and those panhandle areas in eastern New Mexico is La Nina, because that's one part of the U.S. that always gets drier. And I do think the fading El Nino really robbed that part of the country a wet spring. I mean, we have seen the storms go more north, and the winter wheat country has definitely not done as well this spring. I mean, there's still a chance for some moisture, but nothing like last year. I mean, last year, the rains in Kansas were amazing. I mean, just in some of those western areas of Kansas, eastern Colorado, the panhandles, they really turned the corner. But going back to La Nina is a concern. So when we talked about the dryness in the southwestern United States, it could expand into West Texas, into southwest Kansas, parts of eastern Colorado. That is an area that I am concerned about going back to dry, because when we go into these La Nina patterns, you have less monsoonal moisture coming up out of Mexico. You tend to see the storm track go further north, which is exactly what has happened this spring. So that's one area of the country that if we were to talk about, at least in the summer, droughty, that would be an area that I'm going to watch. Now, the winter season, I don't think necessarily doesn't necessarily mean they'll be dry, but when you look at how much falls on an average basis between December and February in the western high plains, that part of the U.S. doesn't normally rain or snow much anyway. So you don't really have a chance to catch up, at least early in the winter. You got to make your hay in spring and summer in those parts of the world.
Yeah, for sure. Well, Donna, I'll have you stick around. We'll come back here later on in the program, and we'll take a look at our long-term weather. And when I say long-term, I mean more 7 to 10 days here. We've been talking 180 days, 205 days out. We're going to shorten it up just a little bit and talk about the near term, I guess. So stick around, folks. We'll be back on the Working Ranch Radio Show after this. Welcome back to the Working Ranch Radio Show. As we head into this next segment, just a thought to be thinking of. I've noticed that in our industry, one of the things that we have been really advancing on and continue to do very well, especially for cow-calf producers, is find the things that we're doing from either management things we're doing or input costs that we're putting into these cattle and try to leverage those in our marketing, such as then really, if you look at the whole concept of programmed cattle, isn't really that kind of what it's all about. Well, today we're going to talk a little bit about that in addition to other elements when it comes to nutrition with our livestock. And joining us here today is Ted Perry, Director of Beef Technical Services for Purina. And Ted, thanks for joining us here today on the Working Ranch Radio Show.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
Well, we had a great discussion before we actually started talking here today as we were talking about grass tetany issues. That may be something we have to visit about at a later time. But nevertheless, in our industry today, as producers are looking at different ways that they can increase value in their products and their programs, looking at participating in these value-added programs is something really to consider. We've had Clint Berry on here from Superior Livestock talking about cattle involved in these value-added programs, some advantages they have there. Again, we're always looking at return on investment, but why should a producer maybe consider looking at that?
Well, I think when we look at how high priced the calves are, adding value, you can add that much more value. But I think one of the things that's important is producers that are doing the right things for their cattle, whether it's vaccination programs, good weaning programs, good cow management programs. The value-added programs allow that information to be passed on so that the buyer knows that these cattle have been treated right, that these cattle are ready to go. So the buyers are willing to pay more for those cattle because there's less risk. I mean, it's literally, if I'm buying cattle, there's risk there, and everything I can do to reduce that risk. And these value-added programs are more of just a documentation of what has been done to the cattle so that the buyer knows what they've been doing rather than green cattle, which, we have no idea what's going on. So it's a reduction of risk. And, the Superior data, K-State does that study every couple of years, that these value-added programs are adding value to those calves.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned something that I think is a key point. As I work with a gentleman that has bought our calves the last 3 years as well out of Iowa, one of the things you really realize when you're direct selling to somebody is they want to reduce that risk. That was one of the things you were talking about. That really is one of our key components in this, is that's really bringing the value.
Well, I mean, if you think about it, it's not so you're reducing risk, but what you're really doing is we're increasing the knowledge of what's going on with those cattle, right? Because I'm going to buy your calves. I want to put them on feed. I want to get them on feed and just they take off. We don't want to mess around with, are they going to break with sickness? And we know that all calves, they might go through some sweats. But the calves that have been maintained, they've got an active, robust immune system, which then Mother Nature can take care of that calf getting through the feedlot. Those calves that have had nothing done to it, they may not have the nutrition background to really mount a strong immune system. And those are the calves that we have a bunch of problems. Mm-hmm. All of the value-added programs, they're adding information so that we know what have been done to the calves. And therefore, it takes out the guesswork as to what these calves need when they hit my feed yard. Mm-hmm. And you said it, you had one person buy your calves for 3 years in a row. If you want to know if your calves are good, then the person who bought them last year comes back and gets them. Mm-hmm. Because if your calves don't do good, he ain't going to call you next year. Yeah. That's a real testament that your cattle are obviously doing well because people come back and buy it.
Yeah. As you were answering that, I was thinking about, it's about our reputation. And maybe we're not, I'm not retaining ownership, but I am passing it on to the next guy. And you want that to carry on to the next person in line.
We talk a lot about reputation cattle. Heck, they all have reputation. Yeah. Good or bad, you decide, but they all have a reputation. Yeah. And, you go when you go sit through some sales, you have some people that, their cattle are not very good reputation. When they go, it's a pretty quick sale. I mean, they basically start them 1 or 2 bids and they're out of there. Mm-hmm. The guys that have good reputation, the place goes nuts and, it takes a lot longer to sell those cattle. Mm-hmm. Your reputation follows the cattle. No matter how much you try to hide it, it's going to be there.
Yeah. So the foundation of that is getting back to the health of these animals. And that starts with the nutritional plane that they're on and making sure they're in a position physically so that they can continue on, as you were alluding to just a bit ago. So the nutrition factor into marketing in these cattle, it's kind of where that starting point's going to be at. I mean, I realize genetics are a part of this as well, so I don't want to throw that out, the genetic side of it, but then your genetics can only do so much. Your nutritional is what's going to help your genetics come alive.
Well, exactly. What if you think about it, you've got to feed that genetic potential of that calf. The genetics are there to set that calf up to do wonderful things. But you've got to feed the beast, right? You've got to feed that genetic potential. And one of the things that we're learning more about all the time is that interaction between nutrition and health, because there's a couple of things that we're learning. That one, what needs to happen in that calf from a nutrition standpoint, that they've got all the tools to get that rumen going, and they've got all the tools to mount an immune response. One is protein, energy, all of that stuff is important. The other thing that's important that we forget a lot of times is just total intake. Okay. So if I've got calves on feed and they're eating 15 pounds of feed, we know when they get sick, they're going to drop intake to about half. Mm-hmm. Well, then they're going to drop to 7, 8 pounds. Well, there's still enough energy to keep the system going as they go through and come out the other side. But if I've only got calves eat 7, 8 pounds of dry matter and they get sick and you drop to 4, now the immune system completely shuts down because the calf is literally pulling energy stores to stay alive. Mm-hmm. And those are the calves that get sick and have a big problem, because if you don't have an active immune response, all the Drax in the world isn't going to save you. You've got to have that active immune response. And that gets back to what we talked about, the value-added calves. They know that those calves have the nutrition and the immune system that if they get sick, they will mount immune response and get better on them. That's what we're really looking for.
Mm-hmm. We're talking a lot here just from a terminal side of things, and that's pretty important because the majority of our cattle, of course, are headed to a terminal endpoint. But the other side of that then is those replacements, is those cattle that we're going to keep back. In fact, right now, next week, we're going to be bangs vaccinating our replacement heifers for next year, spaying the ones we don't want to breed. So from that side of things, when we look at these cattle that are going to be future replacement cattle, either for us or somebody else's operation, that component is pretty key as well.
Well, right, because, and we tend to, I shouldn't say I tend to think in terms of the feedlot calf, right? They go to the calf, they get sick, there's numbers. The ones that really were potential to mess up the most are those replacement heifers, because those are the girls that have the culmination of our genetic program that we're going to pass along. Well, if we screw her up, especially, the first 2 weeks on feed, if we screw her up, she may never recover. She may go, she may make it in the repro herd, but she's not going to be that bigger heifer. And we know that the heifers that get off to a good start, they're the ones that breed early, and the heifers that breed early tend to rebreed early and stay in the herd longer. If we get them behind at the start, she may never catch up. She may get bred, but then, we miss her as a 2-year-old or 3-year-old. Yeah. And we're just wasting a whole lot of good genetics. We blame it on the genetics. Well, she just wasn't a very good heifer. No, it may be because we screwed her up in the feed yard, just in the weaning pen getting started. So that's where the nutrition is important all the way through. And it's probably, like you said, it's probably more important for the replacement animals and potential herd bulls. Mm-hmm. What if we screw them up? They'll never hit their genetic potential. So, we call them because of lack of performance. Well, it's probably not genetics. It's probably liver abscesses screwed something up there. So we got to be very careful from a nutrition standpoint. And it sounds oversimplistic, but what we really need to do from a nutrition standpoint is get the cattle what they need when they need it. Just kind of get out of their way and let them take care of themselves. We don't have to overcomplicate this.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I think that's part of the thing too. Years ago, a lot of people there was a couple times of the year where people would mineral. Now we're seeing it a little bit more on an annual basis. And I think that is a point of saying, just having it in front of these animals on a year-round basis is important.
Mm-hmm. Yes. The whole fetal programming, we've done some really cool work with North Dakota State where we look at just the mineral response to that fetal programming. And it's just phenomenal how it gets those calves off to a good start. But the year-round mineral is so much more important. And the other thing that we're finding with mineral, by feeding the mineral, not only feeding the cow, but we're literally setting up the rumen. So we can literally reduce your feed bill by feeding mineral because we're increasing the digestibility of the forage. And all of that works together. And we're finding out more and more all the time that, that's, basically the girls need mineral year round, if nothing else, just to feed the rumen bugs. And then that sets off the cascade of events that pushes everything else to its limit.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, here's something I want to have you educate me a bit about. We were talking a bit ago about value-added programs in there, and this was something I wasn't really aware of, so I wanted a little more explanation about it. But what are some of the value-added programs that Purina offers producers regarding our nutrition in our livestock?
And this is new for us. Mm-hmm. Historically, Purina we're a feed company and we sell feed, but what we're now getting involved with is some of these value-added programs. And there's 2 programs in particular. One is the Purina Plus program, and the Purina Plus program, to make it simple, it's the nutrition bolt-on part for all of the back 45-day programs. So whether it's Zoetis's or Boehringer Ingelheim's or Merck's, they all have, with their vaccine programs, they've got their back 45-day programs, correct? And part of that program is always the cattle have to be bunk broke for 45 days, which really what that means is the calves have not nursed for 45 days. But what they also realize is if we don't have the nutrition component in there, that we're not going to build the immune system in that calf and really get the titers that they want from those. So we're working with them. The Purina Plus program is basically, it's the nutrition part of a VAC 45-day program, so that the nutrition and the vaccine and all the health management, that works better. So you've got a better calf out at the end. So that's the Purina Plus program that many people are talking about and using. And we're still refining that a little bit because it can be confusing as to, which does it work with. And basically, if you have a VAC 45-day program, the Purina Plus program is designed to be the nutrition program to bolt on top of that. Does that make sense?
Yep. That makes sense. Mm-hmm.
And then the newest one that we have, that this program actually grew out of the Purina Plus program. And this came to us from order buyers that said that what their producers really want to know, and it gets back to the whole immune system and everything that we talked about with feeding mineral year round, is what their producers want to know is, were these cows on a good mineral program? So out of that, we started the Wind and Rain value added program. And it's really simple. If your cows have been on mineral year round, then they are they can be part of the Wind and Rain program. And we introduced that kind of as a launch with Superior last year, and the Superior folks took off with it. Mm-hmm. They sold in excess of 22,000 head, and it's gone really great for them. And like I said, they're asking for more calves all the time. And we talked earlier about Kansas State does their evaluation of them. We don't have the data back, but what the Superior reps have said is it's working very well, and they really like it because it's something else that they can bring from value to their producers. It's all they have to ask is, are you feeding Wind and Rain mineral? They work with the dealer. It comes down to if they bought 2 bags of mineral per cow, gives you a year-round mineral program. Then that certification follows them through, and it's really gaining popularity. I think one of the things is it does what it needs. Okay, it shows that the cows have the mineral that they need, and the calves will mount an immune response that we're looking for. And it's so darn simple to get into. I mean, did I buy 2 bags of mineral? I put that out. My cows are in a year-round mineral program. Boom, we're done. That's the real beauty of the program. It's so simple and so quick. And like I said, Superior took off with it, but we're adding that to a lot of other auction markets. And if somebody has interest in it, feel free to get a hold of us at PurinaMills.com, and you'll end up getting a hold of me.
Yeah.
And we can talk about it. And I'd love to see the program grow because it's so simple and it's such an easy way to add value to these cattle that I would just like to see it grow a lot more. And best way to grow it is by word of mouth.
You bet. All right. Well, Ted, a lot of good information here. I appreciate the discussion with you as we were talking about some of the value-added elements to it, as well as the nutritional factors when we're marketing our livestock as well. Appreciate the information here today. Again, PurinaMills.com/cattle. If you want more information on that, that's where you can go to do that. Ted, thanks for joining us here today on the Working Ranch Radio Show.
Thanks for having me. Have a good week.
You bet. You too. And again, that was Ted Perry, Director of Beef Technical Services for Purina. I always enjoy discussion that kind of gets my mind thinking about some of the things that we do, from input costs, from management things, and how we can leverage that. Some great discussion from Ted on that and how we can utilize our mineral program in marketing our livestock as well. Again, that website, should you want more information, you can go to their website at PurinaMills.com/cattle. Well, stay with us. Up next, the Captain Tim O'Byrne will be in for this week's edition of Tim's 2 Cents, and we'll have meteorologist Don Day back with a look at our long-term weather. We'll be back after this.
Looking for the perfect gift for a gardener or weather enthusiast? Introducing the Tropo, a precision rain gauge that has revolutionized both reliability and convenience. Expertly engineered by meteorologists, the Tropo gauge boasts rugged durability, impeccable accuracy, and precision to the 100th of an inch. Visit measurerain.com to order a Tropo today and use code RAINDAY. That's RAINDAY for free shipping and 10% off. Go to measurerain.com.
Hey, Justin. Hey, everybody out there in Working Ranch Radio Land. We are putting the final touches on the summer issue of Working Ranch magazine, and I got to tell you, it's a log jam packed full of excellent articles, photographs, all kinds of stuff in there, as usual. And one article I wanted to bring to your attention, folks, we have a piece on the Society for Range Management's 77th annual conference that they held in Sparks, Nevada here a while back. And 1,600 people attended that conference. And so I was noodling around online here while we were working on the issue, and went on their Facebook page, and I got to tell you, it's pretty cool. You folks that are into social media, go on there and check it out, because they got some unique things that I've never seen before. They introduce a lot of people, which is great. I like to see what people are doing and who they are and what they're thinking. And then they have another one. They post it. This just shows up about, maybe once a week, once every 10 days, job opening. And it could be a ranch manager, it could be academia, range specialist or something like that. And I think it's fantastic. They go to great lengths to keep the page vibrant. And check it out, Society for Range Management. Back to you, Justin, in the booth, and the rest of you, get back to work.
All right, thanks, Captain. Appreciate the update there in regards to the Society for Range Management, a great organization doing a lot of good work on behalf of our industry. By the way, too, as he mentioned, you can check them out on their social media page, but also you can find them on their webpage as well at rangelands.org. Well, we're going to bring back into our program meteorologist Don Day. If you're just jumping in here now on the program, he was with us earlier in the show as we were getting that extended look at our long-term forecast. And Don, as we look out in these next 7 to 10 days, what do you see continuing to happen across this? I know you'd also mentioned until we get past Mother's Day, things aren't really going to start to normalize a bit.
Yeah, and we're still sticking with that. I do see a pattern change after this upcoming weekend, and really, especially as we get to the third week of May. The areas of the United States that have been getting wet over the next week will continue to get wet. So there's going to be more Corn Belt rain. Parts of central and southeast Texas, we've seen some flooding. Mm-hmm. They're going to see some more rain. I am a little more optimistic that some of those areas of western Kansas and the panhandles have a better chance of seeing some shower and thunderstorm activity. Now, they certainly need more, but they're going to be getting more over the next week than they've had over the last couple. So that's good. Mm-hmm. It's going to be wet along the Gulf Coast. It's going to be wet across the upper Midwest, meaning eastern Dakotas, Minnesota, Wisconsin, into the Great Lakes, and then along the East Coast looks pretty wet as well. We are going to see a drier trend developing in the Pacific Northwest, California, back into Arizona. And that is to be expected. As we get into this time of year, we tend to start to see high pressure building there that starts to dry out the West Coast and get them into their different season. And then what we tend to see by the third to fourth week of May is that a high pressure expanding eastward. And so what'll happen is we're going to see a cool pattern developing in the central and eastern United States in the next 7 to 14 days. A lot of the central and eastern United States has had been very springy, very warm, really nice warm spring temperatures. They're going to be a little bit cooler, while some of the cooler weather that's been in the northern plains, the northern Rockies, and even the Pacific Northwest is going to start to see things get warmer, especially after the third weekend of May. And then all of a sudden, we're into that period of time where you can really start talking the S word. You can start talking about summer beginning to evolve and build on in.
You bet. All right. Well, Don, thanks for joining us here on the program today.
Thanks for having me.
You bet. And if you enjoyed listening to Don here today and his perspective about our extended weather forecast, you can actually catch him each and every morning through his daily video podcast at dayweather.com. Stick around. I'll tell you what's in store for next week after this. How do you keep a multi-generational ranch in the family? That's coming up next week on the Working Ranch Radio Show. Be sure to tune in for that. The Working Ranch Radio Show is a production of Working Ranch Magazine, branded #1 by America's Ranchers. Now, if you'd like to get a subscription started to Working Ranch Magazine, it's pretty easy. You can go to workingranchmag.com. Well, if you'd like to get a hold of me again, my email address is justin.workingranch@gmail.com. Thanks for joining us. I'm Justin Mills, and until next time, keep your chin down and your mind in the middle. So long.